I'm probably the farthest traveled participant in this meeting, but I'm very grateful for the invitation because, as I said before, it had enormously refreshing aspects which I missed for the last 20 years in other meetings. Yes, we had a fantastic morning yesterday summing up the level of sophistication and fine titration between cardiologists, cardiac surgeons, when it comes to transcatheter therapies. But the angle you brought in with the pediatric side of things allowed for the first time to challenge us on the adult side with a question which had been brushed under the carpet in the whole euphoria of transcatheter therapies of the last 20 years, namely, what about the valve? And in the 90s, there was still a lot of research activity going on towards longer-lasting valves, and if you talk to the companies, they all dropped it from one day to the next when the TAVI era started. I'm showing you that picture of Cape Town not only because I want to boast how beautiful the place is where I've been allowed to live for the last almost 30 years, but also as a geographic example for those 40 million patients with rheumatic heart disease who have a totally different reality and who have been left out with their problem for these last 20 years. And I must admit, when I accepted the Chris Barnard chair almost 30 years ago in cardiothoracic surgery coming from Zurich, I brought with me all my passion for tissue engineering. But I realized relatively quickly that in an environment where patients are young and in desperate need for valve surgery, we need something now and not, as we were half-jokingly saying, like with atomic fusion in another 50 years. The green button, yes? Yeah. So those of you my age, not any I can see in this room, can remember the excitement in '69 when the first jumbo jet did its maiden flight, and that was only 1 year after we flew to the moon. And it was only 60 years before when the Kitty Hawk took to the skies for the first time. And those 60 years saw two world wars, saw a massive depression. And still, this is quite an achievement. So listening to all the talks yesterday, we could, with a bit of goodwill, argue that, well, coming from that first valve, which was implanted in the 60s, in the early 60s, 60 years later, well, we may have achieved a lot now. But in the end, it boils down to that. It's a glutaraldehyde fixed xenograft valve on a little bit more professionally sutured stent. And all that was added was a way to deploy it transcatheter routes. So these were the two things that changed. And I don't think we can be proud of 60 years of bioprosthetic or even prosthetic research in heart valves. Ironically, the very first ever heart valve replacements were done in rheumatic patients. And they were the driver in the first world. Allow me these outdated terms, but they make it a little bit easier to express it. Rheumatic heart disease was rampant in the United States and Europe after the World War because of poor socioeconomic circumstances. It was the main driver, not the ASDs, the main driver behind cardiac surgery. And you can see the age of those two patients, 40 years. This is still the age of our patients. So what happened? I think this is something where every single product in the world looks in pale envy at the heart valve companies, because every other one had to improve a product. Heart valve companies could wait until the patients had improved. They started with 40-year-old ones, and you can see how steep, and we saw it even in children, and these are 40-year-old ones, how still the degeneration curve was. Miraculously, just make them 80 years old, and it's not a problem anymore. So one does understand that the motivation was not as burning. And if you just look at this here, this is now the distribution of transcatheter implants. This is Germany, versus surgical implants, and they are 81 years old, and the others are 68 years old. This is a dream if I were a bioprosthetic valve company. But this is our reality. Charles Janka knows it well, but I believe very few of you have seen what a rheumatic valve looks like. You can repair a few, and there are a couple of artists amongst us, particularly in India and Thailand, who can repair even more. But this is a doomed valve, and it can only be replaced. This is the burden of disease. And if you talk, and this is very interesting, if you talk even to governments in third world countries, they will reassure you that rheumatic heart disease is going down rapidly. In fact, acute rheumatic fever is going down rapidly, and we all don't understand what's really happening because the disease itself of chronic rheumatic heart disease is still there. And you can see these are deaths, and this is South Asia, and this is Africa between 1990 and 2000. So the same number of people per million die, but the population has doubled. So we have actually more patients needing surgery for rheumatic heart disease today than we had 30 years ago. And this shows you that even in urban circumstances, because you hear of these huge centers in China, in India, in Brazil, even in South Africa, where we of course see a growing number of an urban population also with degenerative disease. And still, this is our distribution curve, and half of these patients are also coronaries, calcific aortic stenosis, and still, this is the STA's distribution of age. And this is when rheumatic patients become symptomatic. Those of you in the front line can read it, 11 to 15 years, this is when it starts. So we really have a problem. And we have only valves which were made for 1/7 of the global population of North America, Europe, and Japan. And if we put a mechanical valve in, which Volkmar Falk yesterday, of course, rightfully said it's undervalued under your circumstances for young patients, but this is our 2 o'clock in the morning pleasure, if a patient even arrives at surgery. And we all have heard what happens to tissue valves in the young. We had also a little bit following in the footsteps of Charles Janka, we had at the 50th anniversary of the first heart transplant in Cape Town, we had brought all the big 5 societies in cardiac surgery and the World Heart Federation together for an umbrella to help, amongst other things, establish local capacity for surgery. Because that's the second problem. You can have the best valves in the world if you can't put them in because you don't have cardiac surgery. And those main drivers were 15 countries which also put their stats together. And we came to really amazing insights, amongst others, to see the transition, the epidemiological transition from poor to rich. And yes, blue is degenerative. In the end, they are 4 times more than even the worst affected countries with rheumatic heart disease. But you see, first of all, because of numbers of patients, there are still millions on the rheumatic side. And you see that even India and China are only halfway through. So in their big urban centers, they do operate on 80-year-old aortic stenosis. They even import quite a number of TAVIs from the US, but that doesn't reflect their true situation. And the next step we did together was to assess needs versus available cardiac surgeries. And if you take the 1,200 per million in the United States and in Europe as 100%, you can see how dismal it is. All those black countries, 1% of the population gets surgery. So this is important. We need not only better valves, we need means to get the valves into the patients without building highly expensive centers. And this is just one of my side pet topics, of course, the hygiene coefficients, where you have countries where the private medicine provides levels like in South Africa, which are European, and the public sector lies at 7% of the minimum the WHO prescribes. But India, 22% of the population who need it get heart surgery, valve surgery. China, same thing. You leave Beijing, 100 kilometers outside, you have that. And if you look particularly in China at the numbers, altogether, almost 80,000 patients every year with rheumatic heart disease do not get the operation they need. So this is not a provocative, but a true statement. First world products are simply not good enough for 6/7 of mankind. And they are particularly not good enough regarding longevity, but also access. So one slightly busy slide explains immediately what was yesterday stated on the kid side. There is no market, there is no incentive. We accept that in Europe, in America, mitral aortic is 1 to 3. So the mitral is the bigger one for us, the smaller one for you, but you have a huge proportion of repairs, and even the replacements are old. There are hardly any patients younger than 60 years. And this, you saw it before, this is a tiny proportion, 4% need a valve replacement younger than 59 years of age. And the rest is 68, 81. So incentive 0. There is a fringe group, yes, TAVIs for patients younger than 75. I think the improvements which valve companies admittedly have made in the last few years, but half-heartedly should be enough for that. If we talk about decellularization, 2 of them are using alcohol washouts of cells, so you can almost call it decellularization. Tissue valves for patients younger than 60, also not the big challenge. Tissue valves for fringe groups, for the kids, for the adolescents, for young athletes, and of course females who are still in the childbearing age. The big difference between 1/7 and 6/7 is A, the age of the patients, but B, if you look at that, apart from the numbers, 350,000 versus 1.4 million, if the commercial side of things hasn't discovered that yet, I don't know what else it needs. But also AR over AS. You see primarily AS, we see primarily non-calcific AR. That means even solutions are not just transferable. And then we come to the point which was the main topic of this session today, immunogenicity as the key to at least improve bioprosthetic valves to a degree that they become acceptable. And we have shown in the late 90s, decisively shown that the degeneration is immunogenic. And we were really finding a very hostile environment for 10 years until slowly everyone came on board. And if you compare here, of course, decellularization is really a major step to include in a bioprosthetic valve which should last longer. But as we also heard before, the extracellular matrix can't be ignored. And since that very first solution needs to give us something quick, we briefly gave up on the idea of getting cells and regeneration into those tissues. And therefore, cross-linking is at least a good compromise on top of decell. And you can see you can almost knock it out. Polymer would be ideal, but when you say polymer, everyone immediately says, yeah, but Nina Braunwald put in a polymer valve in 1958 and it failed dismally. That was a polymer that had surface degradation. Today we have polymers which are totally non-degradable. And if you look even for traces of calcification, it's non-immunogenic, it's the perfect material. And if you look at what you can do with a polymer valve, you can make it very thin. You can, of course, put it into stents. You can do anything, and you will always get better results as with the best of all bioprosthetic tissue. You can surface modify it. You can put heparin on it, but you can also do all other sorts of things. And you can fine titrate what we've heard before about the dead corners where thrombi are being generated first. You can again work with thickness and everything. And last not least, you may have read about the TAPS dilator in the 40s. These were general surgeons who saved tens of thousands of patients. They were capable of pushing something through the apex and the mitral valve. It didn't need a cardiac surgeon, it didn't need cardiac surgery. So if we can come up for the middle-income countries, not even only for the low-income countries, with something which gives a general surgeon something like that in his hands, it's already a big leap forward. This is just to show you in 5 months implants, these polymer valves in sheep, for instance, but also in pigs. We have by now 260 large animal implants. They are exciting. And we have some movement in the field. As an American product, Foldax has gone now into 40 aortic valves up to 3 years. They just got permission to start mitral implants. But what is interesting is that they also, from the beginning, said they are aiming at the rheumatic field in the middle-income countries. And we have, over the last 12 years, developed a solution which follows the principle of the TAPS dilator. Transapical, everyone should be able to do it with self-homing balloons, with hollow balloons, using balloon expandable stents because you can't add a pacemaker in the third world. And as I said, in 260 large animals, we didn't see one block. And of course, you can go further. This is one of our collaborations with the ETH in Zurich, where you can, of course, 3D print in the end these valves. And also, on the tissue engineering side, I have never given up on my dream of all the years. And again, with Volkmar Fark's group and Herstrup's group in Zurich, we have published quite a lot in that field. But as I said in the beginning, we need something before. And that brings me to my last slide. We have seen that the market incentive to develop something can only come from the rich countries. They represent a tiny minority. The market advantage which exists in the part of the world where you have the other 6/7 hasn't fully sunk in yet, that it's the numbers which may still make it attractive. But we can't wait. Our patients are 42 years in average when they come to surgery. And when I say ours, it's in Brazil, it's in India, it's in China, it's in South Africa. We still need to find an access solution for the poor countries outside the middle-income countries. And there, we need to wake up that we need to find the solution ourselves, and we mustn't get carried away with the illusion that growing urban populations will eventually give us anyway the same patients, so why not import American products? They will remain a tiny minority for a long time. Thank you very much.